Okay, now in May 2020 we heard a lot about the Second World War, understandably. This was the 75th anniversary of D-Day and a crucial step in the defeat of the Nazi German regime. You do get, however, a lot of simplified myth-making though, which ignores the complex, fraught and not at all homogeneous experiences of people during that conflict. Which brings us to my latest selection for May's Miniatures. Worldly, urbane, cynical, lapsed Catholic, full Catholic, left-wing. Yep, it's time for the Greenster. Graham Greene. His brother Hugh Carlton Greene was a great reforming Director-General of the BBC in the 1960s, allowing it to broadcast That Was the Week That Was, Steptoe and Son, Till Death Us Do Part, Up the Junction, Cathy Come Home, etc. Mary Whitehouse hated him. Yeah, we all know all this stuff. Lesser known is his role in propaganda broadcasting during the Second World War and his Cold Warrior journalism during the Korean War in 1950-51. He was a hard-nosed liberal realist. Graham's fiction isn't too far removed from Hugh's general outlook, but is crucially independent from his brother's largely loyal Atlanticism. In his old age, Graham was opposing the US intervention in Nicaragua under the Reagan regime. A good example of what we might call Pinter's Law, whereby you get more anti-establishment when you get older. In his younger days, Graham Greene did get a bee in his bonnet about the saccharine commercialism of Shirley Temple films and was embroiled in a libel suit for his negative review of the film Wee Willie Winkie from 1938. He claimed that the film's sexualisation of its child star undermined its religious pro-family values stance. He'd lost, and 21st Century Fox and Temple were awarded £3,500 in damages, which is worth about 220 grand today. 11 years later, he wrote the screenplay for The Third Man, directed by Carol Reed, and of course featuring Orson Welles, which profoundly and chillingly exposes Harry Lime's charming amorality and indifference to people's lives and health amid wider society. Now I'm going to read The Lieutenant Died Last. This was published in the American magazine Collier's on the 29th of June 1940. It is Greene, by this time an MI6 intelligence officer, fashioning a morally complicated myth. This is stark, powerful storytelling published at the end of a dark month in British and world history. It says much about social class divisions, then and now, and makes it clear that heroism is not at all clear-cut. The Lieutenant Died Last. An unrecorded victory in 1940. There had been a lot of grumbling in the village of Potter before the astonishing night when the parachutists descended. Grumbling about rations, compulsory service, blackouts, all the usual things. Then, apparent disaster, a touch of heroism, a good many deaths put an end to it for a while, as it always does. Though the hero, old Bill Purvis, the poacher, had more reason to grumble than any, for he received no decorations, only a grudging commendation from Major Barlow, the local magistrate, who let him off this once with a caution after he'd been caught red-handed with a rabbit in each deep pocket. You would hardly expect to find Potter the scene of the first invasion of England since French troops landed near Fishguard in the Napoleonic War. It is one of those tiny, isolated villages you still find dumped down in deserted corners of what we call in England Metroland, the district where commuters live in tidy villas within easy distances of the railway, on the edge of scrubby commons full of clay pits and gorse and rather withered trees. Walk for 3 miles in any direction from Potter and you will find cement sidewalks, nurses pushing prams, the evening paper boy. But Potter itself lies off the map. off the motoring map, that is to say. You have to take a turning marked no through road and bump heavily towards what looks to be a farm gate, stuck a mile or more over the shaggy common. Through the gate is nothing but Potter, and Potter is only one public house, the Black Boar, landlord Brewitt, one cash store and post office kept by Mrs. Margeson, a small tin-roofed church where services are held on the first Sunday in the month, half a dozen cottages, a village pond, and the gates, grounds and mansion of Lord Drew. But even those gates are not used. Lord Drew has other gates on the London road 2 miles away and never needs to pass through Potter. One of the cottages is inhabited by old Bill Purvis. One wall has been repaired with petrol tins, and when the door opens, smoke blows out into Potter. He is said to sleep on a bed of rags, but nobody but the local policeman has ever visited him there, and the window is obscured by sacking. 3 or 4 times a year, usually on bank holidays, old Bill Purvis visits the Black Boar, buys a bottle of whiskey, and disappears for 24 hours. It was suspected, but never known for certain before the parachutists came, that old Purvis slipped on those occasions into Lord Drew's grounds, laid his traps, and lay out all day and night with his bottle. He never seemed to know what cold was, any more than an animal, and he was rather like an animal himself. Something grey and fleeting that you see for a moment shambling between hedges. His coat stuck out as if he were a scarecrow on a stick because he carried an old Mauser rifle under his coat, for which he had never paid a licence. That was the odd scene of this invasion, though if you examine Potter carefully you may conclude that it was not an accident that the parachutists landed there. Potter itself could be isolated by a few snips of a wire cutter, and from that little hidden spot in Metroland, half a dozen men, acting quickly, could do an astonishing amount of damage. 1.5 miles across, unfrequented common, and you had the main line to Scotland and the northern coast. And one supposes that the German air chiefs had planned a number of such attempts which our air defences foiled. Their psychological effect might have been incalculable. They would have destroyed the sense of security Englishmen still feel, the security which allows them to grumble. Look at the effect on Potter. We are a small island, and there isn't a village anywhere which isn't accustomed to the sound of aeroplane engines. The plane they heard in the Black Boar was flying fairly low, perhaps 3,000 feet, but there was nothing out of the ordinary in that. It was the fag end of a cloudy spring day. Mrs. Margeson in the cash stores had just closed the post office counter because it was 6:30. The shop remained open for general goods till 8, and the lean man, who was Lord Drew's undergardener, was criticising the beer in the public bar. "It's the war, they tell you," he said bitterly. "Everything's the war." There wasn't a man left in any of the cottages. They were all in the public bar, except old Purvis, and the women were washing up the supper things. Old Purvis, with his coat sticking queerly out and a bottle of whiskey in his deep poacher's pocket, was skirmishing along by Lord Drew's wall among the high nettles. The gamekeeper had sworn to get him, and he wasn't taking any chances. He was the only one to see the parachutists descend. He looked up, under his old grey brows, with a kind of angry astonishment, as a number of men suddenly appeared in mid-air under things like enormous parasols. He didn't know what they were. He only had a feeling they were best avoided. "It didn't seem right," he said afterwards. He meant that it didn't seem fair, people peeping at you like that out of the sky. That was all he saw for a long time, because just at that moment he found the weak point in Lord Drew's wall. The men were in uniform, for their own protection, one supposes. Otherwise they would have been liable to the death penalty as non-combatants, but their uniforms caused no immediate astonishment in Potter, because we are so used in these days to uniforms, what with AFS and ARP and all the other initial letters, we are prepared for any uniform, even a German uniform. Mrs. Brewitt saw them at work on the telegraph and telephone wires and thought they were something to do with the post office. Only her son, who was 16 and, alas for him, knowledgeable, said they were Germans. "Nonsense," Mrs. Brewitt said. Mrs. Margeson in the cash stores hardly looked up when the officer came in. He carried a large-scale map of the district and had a revolver at his belt. His steel helmet made her think. Manoeuvres. She said promptly, "The post office is closed," because she didn't think he looked like a shop customer. He said, "Madam," and that struck her as foreign. A Frenchman or a Pole, she thought. He was a young man, very fair, and his uniform was very muddy. He sounded nervous and preoccupied. She smiled. "Yes, what can I do for you?" "Please," he said, "go at once to the inn." "The inn?" "Yes, you must go at once. Everyone must go." "I don't understand." He said, with embarrassment, as though he were making a rather absurd claim, "I am a German officer, and this village is occupied by my men." With great presence of mind, Mrs. Margeson picked up the shop telephone and dialed a police call. The young man made no attempt to stop her. She could at once tell why. The wires had been cut. At that moment, through the window, she saw Driver, the village constable, being impelled down the road towards the Black Boar by two men in uniform. He had probably been digging in his garden as he was in his shirt sleeves. More or less the same scene took place all over the village. Everybody who was not already at the Black Boar was rounded up and persuaded, pushed, or even carried there. The Germans were determined that nobody should leave the village and carry the alarm, but they missed young Brewitt, who had hidden in the outside lavatory, and, of course, old Purvis. The German officer addressed them in the public bar. He told them that nobody was in danger from him or his men. All they had to do was keep quiet. The gamekeeper, who had been caught hunting old Purvis and had a black eye, said in a loud voice, "It's a scandal." The German officer paid him no attention. He went on to warn them that any attempt to escape would be fatal. He said frankly, "Our chance depends on none of you getting away." And that reference to a chance, for what chance had a dozen Germans planked down in the middle of England, suggests that they had a desperate hope they might be picked up again by plane before their presence was discovered. He said, "You will be closely guarded, and any attempt to escape will mean death." He added with a note of entreaty, "You've only to remain quiet for a few hours." All this time, of course, old Purvis had been comfortably curled up just inside Lord Drew's wall. He knew that the house was shut up, and the only possible interference would be the gamekeeper or the policeman. The policeman was digging and would be too tired later to prowl. As for the gamekeeper, old Purvis despised him. He set a couple of traps, loaded his gun, opened the bottle of whiskey, and began to drink. He always calculated that a little drink improved his aim, and he had high hopes of a bird or two that evening. He was disturbed by a shot. His first feeling was indignation rather than curiosity. Lord Drew was away. A shot meant a rival poacher. He took another long drink, hid the bottle where he could find it again in a hole in the clay bank, and then peeped over the broken stones of the wall. To his astonishment, he saw young Brewitt running and zigzagging down the road that led out of the village to the gate and afterwards to the main road. What had happened was this. Young Brewitt, who had a romantic mind, remained convinced that what he had seen was actually a party of German soldiers cutting the telephone wires. He even guessed how they had arrived. The romantic mind found no difficulty in the idea. So he hid. He would probably have remained hidden if one of the Germans, who had a tidy soul, hadn't wanted to visit the lavatory. He pulled open the door, and young Brewitt darted out like a rat. The soldier was taken by surprise and let him get a start. He shouted, and young Brewitt run the faster. Other soldiers ran out of the inn, and one of them fired and missed. It suddenly became very essential to get him. 3 men waited with their guns raised until he should reach the gate. So, to his amazement, old Purvis watched the astonishing behaviour of young Brewitt. The boy leapt and zigzagged down the road. Then he came to the gate and scrabbled desperately at the catch. 3 rifles went off together, and young Brewitt fell. "The bloody Boers," Purvis said aloud, the old brain creaking rustily back 40 years to South Africa and an ambush on the veldt. Young Brewitt wasn't dead. They had fired humanely at his legs, but he was crippled for life. He shared with Purvis the heroic events of that evening, but there were always some who said that he had intended to hide all night in the lavatory. About old Purvis's movements and intentions there was no doubt at all. He first of all unearthed the whisky bottle, took a long drink and hid it again. Then he took a look at his traps, and then he sidled like a ferret out of Lord Drew's grounds into the high nettles. He slid among them, crouching, his chin protected by a 2 weeks' beard. He had got his gun out from under his coat, the old Mauser rifle that went back like his memory 40 years to another war. It was as if 1914 to 1918 were an interlude he had hardly noticed at all. Young Brewitt had been carried back into the Black Boar, and 2 men had been left on guard. The rest, with the lieutenant, now set off across the common towards the railway line, carrying picks and crowbars, their rifles slung. 2 carried a box between them. Old Purvis, working his way like a bloody Boer himself from gorse bush to gorse bush, followed. The sun was setting over by Fenham Heath station 3 miles away. It shone just over the curve of the horizon, on the last prams going home, on the circulating library where the vicar's wife was changing her detective story, and on the little stream of commuters back from town carrying attaché cases. That was a quiet, orderly, conventional world to which neither Purvis nor his quarry belonged. They were united out of sight but hardly out of hearing in a common spirit of wildness, vindictiveness, adventure. Old Purvis gave an odd little chuckle as he bobbed quickly out of sight behind a gorse bush. He knew the common, of course, as well as he knew Lord Drew's estate, and at first he thought, because of the tools they carried, which he could now see clearly in the darkening air, that they were bound for the gravel pit, dry and abandoned 20 years ago, 100 yards from the railway line. A miniature one-track line connected it with a disused siding, and an old steel truck lay on its side, tipped off the rail. But the Boers passed that by, clambering up the embankment onto the line beyond. Old Purvis, worming his way along towards the gravel pit, thought they were a beautiful sight. Outlined like that against the sky, they had left their rifles, all but 2 men, in the bushes below the embankment, so that they could slide quickly and inconspicuously down if a train appeared. On that long stretch of rail, you could see an engine's steam 2 miles away. Now 4 of them bent and pulled and worked at the rails. 2 followed the lieutenant further down the line with the box, and 2 stood rather slackly on guard, watching the empty waste of common and the up and down line. They never saw old Purvis get down into the gravel pit. He scrabbled up to the edge where a bush hid him and got a line on one of the armed guards. The unarmed ones could wait. With a man's body clear against the sight, old Purvis chuckled. It was like youth again. All sorts of sly memories came back, of nurses at Pretoria and drinking evenings in Joburg. He pulled the trigger, and before the shattering explosion of the ancient rifle could clear, the man was down, holding his stomach with both hands. His rifle toppled over the embankment and rolled. It was like one of those trick films that suddenly stop and then go on again fast. Down the line, the officer had swung round with his revolver out. The 2 men with him had their mouths open. Picks and crowbars suddenly stopped, one of them in mid-air. Then life started again. The guard fired at old Purvis's smoke, and the bullet kicked gravel up against his cheek. The men working dropped their tools and tumbled down the embankment to where they had left their rifles. Old Purvis chose his next victim. The Germans were shockingly out of luck. The bright sunset was behind the poacher, dazzling their eyes. He had their silhouettes lit up like dummies in a shooting booth. He began to suck excitedly through a gap in his teeth and fired again. A man halfway down the embankment tumbled, but old Purvis had given away his position, and though he ducked at once, the guard, stretched out now on top of the embankment, nipped a bullet close by his ear. When he took another peep, the workmen had got their rifles, though the 2 men with the box 100 yards up the line were all unarmed. That meant that 4 rifles could be brought to bear, not counting the lieutenant who was crawling back. Old Purvis chuckled again. It was more fun than rabbit shooting. But the others too had learned their lesson. The lieutenant was shouting orders which the poacher couldn't understand. While the guard remained on top of the embankment, the others, taking advantage of the bushes, began to circle round to get the sun behind them. Old Purvis wasn't disturbed. He knew his battlefield. From one end of the gravel pit ran a trench, but because of the overhanging bushes, it couldn't be seen from above. To the watcher on the embankment, he was cornered. Old Purvis, ducking under the gorse into the little hot tunnel, jolted away, looking more than ever like an earth animal going to ground. The trench sloped gently up, and soon he was on all 4s. Then out he came into the tall bracken. He had a daring look. The guard had his eye fixed on the gravel pit. The 2 men up the line had left their box and were crawling towards their rifles. The 3 men and the lieutenant had made a half circle and were now steadily creeping towards the pit. Their backs were half turned to him, and again they had the worst of the light. Old Purvis, at this point of the game, could have retired safely, with all the honours, but he was enjoying himself. He never liked to leave good game alone, if it meant risking capture. He waited until one of the men, in screening himself from the supposed enemy in the gravel pit, had exposed himself to his enemy in the flank. Then old Purvis let him have it proper, or rather he meant to. For the first time he nearly missed altogether. The man dropped his rifle, slumped heavily down, nursing his hand. "Gol darn it," he said, and ducked at once under the bracken. Not one of the men suspected that the shot had come from the rear. They were almost at the rim of the pit now. The lieutenant gave an order. They leapt to their feet and were over it. But this time old Purvis couldn't have made a mistake if he'd tried. Firing quickly, he got to. Only the lieutenant leapt to safety. By that time, the two unarmed men had reached their rifles, and the guard had spotted old Purvis. Before he could get down, a shot from the embankment got his left shoulder. He sat still among the bracken and wished he had some whisky with him. He tried to move, but the swaying bracken gave him away, and a bullet missed him by a centimetre. He swore softly. This time the bloody Boers had trapped him, and there were still 4 of them left. He was saved by a goods engine from Fenham Heath. It was going north with a string of empty trucks. The 3 men now hugged the ground under the embankment, and a whistle warned the lieutenant to keep out of sight. They didn't want a warning carried up the line. They couldn't tell that the nearest troops were 20 miles away at least. As the engine came into sight, old Purvis saw his chance. He bolted through the bracken towards the overturned truck, which would protect him from all of them but the lieutenant. The lieutenant only had a revolver, and the light now was shockingly bad. Nobody fired at him. Then he swung around and sent a shot at the officer who had got out of the gravel pit, but the pain in his shoulder was upsetting his aim, and he missed. All the same, though he didn't know it then, he'd won the game. They were scared and harried and didn't know what to think. All the lieutenant was concerned with now was to get his business finished quickly. He dodged round to his men, and they all began a kind of strategic retirement up the line, along the edge of the embankment. Old Purvis sent another shot after them ineffectively. Then he swore gently because he'd only got 1 shot left. He watched the 4 men, a little puzzled. They were climbing up onto the embankment again. He didn't shoot because the light was bad now and his eye was out. One man fired a warning shot at him, which nicked a tiny piece off the edge of the truck. The others were opening the box. It seemed to contain string. Old Purvis was irritated. He didn't like being ignored. He took aim rather wildly and fired. For a moment, it was as if the end of the world had come, blasting up against the truck which sheltered him. There were lamentable cries. When the fury of air and fire had died away, he came out of shelter and picked his way through the bushes. There was nobody left to fire at him. This was massacre. He didn't like it. It turned his stomach over like dynamiting fish. The strange thing was that the rails were the only things left untorn. The lieutenant was not dead. He called out in English, "Kill me. Please kill me." Old Purvis always felt pity for broken animals, but he hadn't a bullet left. Then he saw the officer's revolver 3 yards away. Afterwards, he looked through his pockets. There was nothing of value, but a photograph of a naked baby on a hearthrug again made his stomach turn over. That was really the end of old Purvis's battle. The rest was only what they call mopping up. He went back to his traps and drank what was left of his whisky. 2 rabbits had already been snared. Then, with the rabbits in his poacher's pockets and the lieutenant's revolver in his hand, he went down cautiously to the Black Boar. There, they had listened fearfully to the sounds of the shots and the explosion. The guards were nearly as scared as the people of Potter. When old Purvis appeared suddenly behind them with the revolver, they surrendered at once. They, with 2 wounded men among the gorse, were the only survivors of the only parachute descent. It had been a discouraging failure for the German High Command because of old Purvis's absence from the village in Lord Drew's grounds. Driver, immediately he was released and saw the rabbits, charged him with poaching, and, as I have said, a week later he was released with a caution and a rather cold commendation. He was quite gratified. He didn't expect medals, and as he said, "I've got one back on them bloody Boers." For a while, people visited him and gave him tips in return for history. "They run just like little rabbits," he used to say, and for the sight of a few souvenirs. But that source of income soon failed, and he was back in no time on the wrong side of Lord Drew's wall. One souvenir he never showed to anyone: the photograph of the baby on the mat. Sometimes he took it out of a drawer and looked at it himself, uneasily. It made him, for no reason that he could understand, feel bad.